The impromptu neighborhood gathering in Michael's backyard continued well into the afternoon. The dismantling of the pool had become secondary to what felt like a support group therapy session centered around Diane Patterson. "She reported my son's graduation party," said Elena Martinez, passing around a plate of empanadas that had materialized from her kitchen. "Called the police at 8:30 p.m. on a Saturday because the music was disturbing the peace. My Jose had just graduated summa cum laude from state." Walter, the elderly man who'd first approached Michael, nodded knowingly. "When my Elaine was still with us, we had bird feeders in the backyard. Diane complained that they attracted pigeons, which she called flying rats." He chuckled, though there was an edge to it. The city inspector who came out ended up giving Elaine gardening tips instead. Drove Diane absolutely batty. The Collins children had set up an impromptu lemonade stand at the edge of Michael's property, doing brisk business with the assembled neighbors. Their mother, Tricia, lowered her voice as she accepted a plastic cup from Michael. "Diane tried to get my twins' treehouse condemned," she confided. "Called it an unpermitted auxiliary structure and claimed it violated height restrictions." The inspector told her that since it was technically a play structure under 12 feet tall, it was exempt from permits. She smiled ruefully. "But she kept at it until we finally took it down." The boys were heartbroken. Michael frowned, watching the Collins twins, who couldn't be more than 10, carefully counting change for Walter. "Why does everyone put up with her?" The question dropped like a stone into still water, creating ripples of uncomfortable silence. Finally, Sarah from 2 doors down spoke up. "It's easier to give in than to fight," she admitted, swirling the wine in her glass. "She's relentless, and she knows everyone at City Hall. Her ex-husband was a councilman before the scandal, and her brother-in-law is in code enforcement. Plus," added a man who'd introduced himself as David from across the street, "she has nothing better to do than make trouble. She took early retirement from the school district and got the house in the divorce. Her entire life is monitoring the street." Michael ran a hand through his hair, surveying the remains of the pool that had somehow united an entire neighborhood against one woman. "Well, I'm not taking down my deck plans because she doesn't like change," he stated firmly. "And you shouldn't have to live in fear of your own neighbor." "Easy to say," Walter replied, leaning heavily on his cane as he stood up. "But that woman has the persistence of a tax auditor and the memory of an elephant. She once waited 2 years to report my Christmas lights because I'd installed a motion sensor floodlight she didn't like." As the afternoon shadows lengthened, neighbors gradually drifted home, each stopping to thank Michael for that unexpected community gathering. Tony, Carlos, and James packed up their tools, having made impressive progress on removing the pool despite the interruptions. "Quite a first month in the new place," Tony remarked as they loaded the last of the pool segments into his truck. "Most people just worry about mortgage payments, not neighborhood terrence." Michael laughed, but his mind was already calculating. If Diane had called the police over a pool removal, what would she do when he started building a deck, or when he eventually repainted the faded exterior? Each home improvement project would become a potential battlefield. As he waved goodbye to his friends, Michael spotted movement behind Diane's lace curtains. She was watching, always watching. He raised his hand in a deliberately friendly wave, and the curtain dropped immediately. That night, as Michael scrolled through deck design ideas on his laptop, his phone pinged with a text from Sarah. "Fair warning. Dee just posted on Nextdoor about the declining neighborhood standards and aggressive new elements on Oakwood Lane. Didn't name you, but everyone knows. Battle lines are drawn *." Michael sighed, set down his phone, and opened a new browser tab. Instead of deck designs, he began researching property laws, city ordinances, and the exact process for requesting a formal property survey. If Diane wanted war, he'd be prepared. Michael wiped his hands on his jeans and approached the police cruiser as the officers stepped out. He recognized one of them. Officer Chen had responded to a house fire on Michael's shift last winter. The officer gave a subtle nod of recognition, but maintained his professional demeanor. "Afternoon, officers," Michael greeted them. Conscious of Diane watching eagerly from her porch, What can I help you with? The younger officer, whose name played Red Ramirez, consulted his notepad. We received a call about a disturbance at this address. Something about illegal demolition, excessive noise, and he squinted at his notes. Toxic waste being dumped into storm drains. Behind Michael, Tony let out a barely suppressed snort. Carlos and James had stopped working and stood awkwardly by the half-dismantled pool. Toxic waste. Michael repeated, unable to keep the incredulity from his voice. It's pool water. Chlorinated, yes, but hardly toxic, and we're draining it into the yard, not the storm system. Not at all, Michael said, leading them through the side gate into the backyard. The pool was now about halfway dismantled, with sections of metal frames stacked neatly on a top. The remaining water, perhaps a foot deep, was being slowly drained into the yard through a garden hose. As you can see, Michael explained, we're being careful. The water's being absorbed into the soil, and we're planning to haul all the materials to the recycling center when we're done. Officer Ramirez nodded, making notes. Officer Chen crouched down to inspect the draining system, then stood up. What about permits? Came Diane's voice. She had abandoned her porch surveillance post and now stood at the open gate, arms crossed tightly. Surely he needs a demolition permit? Environmental clearance? This kind of project can't possibly be up to code. Michael resisted the urge to roll his eyes. I checked with the city before starting. Above-ground pools don't require permits for removal in this county. Officer Chen confirmed with a nod. He's right, ma'am. No permits needed for this type of structure. Diane's expression soured. Well, what about the noise? I can't hear my television programs with all this racket. The backyard had fallen quiet when the police arrived, but Michael noticed that the only previous sounds had been normal conversation and the occasional metallic clank of tools, hardly a noise violation, especially at midday on a Saturday. Officer Ramirez checked his watch. Noise ordinances don't kick in until 9 p.m. on weekends, ma'am. They're well within their rights. Diane's face reddened further. Well, they're decreasing property values. The Henderson's pool was a neighborhood landmark. Her voice had taken on a desperate quality. Property values aren't a police matter, ma'am, Officer Chen said gently but firmly. And homeowners have the right to modify their property as long as they're following city codes, which Mr. Rivera is doing. You don't understand, Diane insisted, her voice rising. This neighborhood has standards. We can't just let people tear things down whenever they please. What's next? Will he paint the house some garage color? Install one of those tacky inflatable Christmas decorations? The officers exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. Officer Chen turned to Michael. Everything looks in order here, sir. You're free to continue with your project. This is outrageous. Diane sputtered, her carefully maintained composure cracking. I pay taxes. I'm a founding member of the Neighborhood Watch. Don't you care about preserving community standards? Officer Ramirez closed his notepad. Ma'am, we respond to violations of the law. There are no violations here. He lowered his voice slightly. And I should mention that making false reports to police is itself a violation. Diane's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, like a fish out of water. With a final glare at Michael, she turned on her heel and marched back toward her house, pausing only to call over her shoulder, "This isn't over, Rivera." As the police officers prepared to leave, Officer Chen lingered for a moment. Word of advice, he said quietly to Michael. Document everything with her. We've had numerous calls from this address before. Numerous? Michael asked. Let's just say you're not special, Chen replied with a wry smile. Last month, she reported the house across the street for having an unauthorized bird feeder. When the police cruiser finally pulled away, Diane's front door slammed with enough force to rattle her own windows. Through the lace curtains, Michael could see her on the phone again, already plotting her next move. Tony clapped a hand on Michael's shoulder. Congratulations, man. You've made your first enemy in the new neighborhood. Lucky me, Michael muttered, turning back to the pool. Let's finish this before she calls the National Guard. Diane stared at the document Michael had placed on her pristine granite counter. Her lips pressed into a thin white line. Outside her kitchen window, the orange survey stakes stood like accusatory fingers, pointing at her trespassing roses. "This is blackmail," she finally said, voice barely above a whisper. Michael shook his head. "It's a compromise. I'm not asking for back rent for the land you've been using. I'm not demanding you destroy your award-winning roses. I'm offering a solution where everyone wins." "Everyone except me," Diane countered, but there was less fire in her voice than before. The past week had taken its toll. The city inspector, her own brother-in-law, had been forced to issue citations for the fence violations, making their family dinners unbearably tense. The costs to relocate the fence properly were astronomical, and the roses simply couldn't be moved without killing them. "You keep your roses," Michael pointed out. "That's a win." Diane's fingers traced the edges of the document. A simple agreement stating that the roses remained on Michael's property with his permission, contingent on her ceasing all complaints against the neighbors and stepping down from her self-appointed role as neighborhood enforcer. "Why not just take them from me?" she asked suddenly, genuine curiosity breaking through her anger. "After everything I've done to make your life difficult, why offer a compromise at all?" Michael considered this, choosing his words carefully. "Because this isn't about revenge, it's about community. Everyone on this street just wants to live their lives in peace." The Hendersons understood community standards, Diane muttered automatically, but the phrase sounded hollow even to her own ears. "The Hendersons lost their house to foreclosure," Michael replied gently. "Whatever standards they maintained, it didn't end well for them." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of children playing somewhere down the street. The Collins twins, most likely, enjoying their freedom from Diane's surveillance. Finally, Diane picked up the pen Michael had placed beside the document. Her hand trembled slightly as she signed her name. "I hope you're satisfied," she said, but the words lacked conviction. "I'll be satisfied when the Martinez boy can practice his trumpet without fear of the police showing up," Michael answered. "And when kids can sell lemonade without being reported for health code violations. And when Walter can put up his Christmas lights without worrying about citation threats." As Michael left Diane's immaculate house with the signed agreement, he noticed her standing at her front window, watching him go with an expression he couldn't quite read. Was it defeat? Relief? Perhaps a bit of both. True to the agreement, the changes on Oakwood Lane were subtle but significant. The neighborhood watch signs that Diane had posted, without official authorization, disappeared overnight. The Collins Treehouse project resumed, this time with Walter offering engineering advice from his days as a bridge inspector. Elena Martinez planted vibrant flowers along her walkway, choices that certainly wouldn't have met Diane's subdued color palette requirements. Most telling was the silence from City Hall. No more surprise inspections. No more citations for minor infractions. Jason Patterson, apparently relieved to be freed from his sister-in-law's constant demands, stopped appearing on the street entirely. Michael's deck took shape over the following weekends, with neighbors occasionally stopping by to offer help or, more often, cold beverages. The construction noise never resulted in a single complaint. Diane herself became a ghost on Oakwood Lane, rarely seen except for brief appearances to tend her roses or collect her mail. The curtains in her front window remained drawn most days. But one evening, as Michael hosted an impromptu gathering on his newly finished deck, he spotted movement in Diane's darkened backyard. She was kneeling among her roses, deadheading spent blooms as the setting sun cast long shadows across both their properties. When she sensed him watching, she straightened up and, after a moment's hesitation, raised her hand in a tentative wave. Michael returned the gesture, then turned back to his guests. He didn't mention seeing Diane, but as Walter raised a toast to good neighbors and proper property lines, Michael thought perhaps healing came in many forms, even in a neighborhood as fractured as theirs had been. The roses continued to bloom spectacularly that summer, straddling an invisible line that no longer divided but somehow united two properties in an unexpected piece. Now, as Michael and his friends worked to dismantle the eyesore in his backyard, Diane's constant surveillance was beginning to feel like a shadow he couldn't shake. "You've got quite the welcoming committee," said Tony, nodding toward Diane's watchful eyes just visible above the fence line. Tony had been Michael's friend since firefighter training, a burly man with a comedian's timing and a weightlifter's build. "She's been like this since day one," Michael replied, keeping his voice low. "Yesterday, she informed me that my mailbox is 3 inches taller than regulation height. I checked the postal guidelines. It's perfectly standard." Carlos, another station buddy, chuckled as he unscrewed a section of the pool's metal frame. "Every neighborhood has one. My block has Mrs. Finkelstein. She measures the grass with a ruler and reports anyone over 3 inches to the city." The morning sun climbed higher, and sweat beaded on Michael's forehead as he worked. The pool was proving more difficult to dismantle than anticipated. Years of exposure had rusted some of the bolts in place, requiring extra muscle and WD-40 to loosen. "So what's the plan once this monstrosity is gone?" asked James, the youngest of the group, a rookie at the station who had volunteered despite barely knowing Michael. "Thinking of building a deck," Michael said, stepping back to survey their progress. "Nothing fancy, just a place to grill and have a few beers after shifts." "The Hendersons never drank in the backyard," came Diane's voice, startling them all. She had moved silently along the fence line and now stood directly behind them, her eyes narrowed with disapproval. They were teetotalers, very respectable people. Michael bit back a sarcastic response. "Well, I'm not the Hendersons, Diane." "Obviously," she sniffed, her gaze sweeping critically over the men's sweaty shirts and cargo shorts. "The Hendersons maintained certain standards. This neighborhood was different before. Well, before people like you started moving in." The thinly veiled insult hung in the air. Michael wasn't sure if she meant firefighters, single men, or something else entirely, but the implication was clear. He didn't belong. Carlos straightened up, his normally jovial expression hardening. "People like what exactly?" Diane backpedaled slightly. "People who don't respect the character of established neighborhoods. People who make changes without consulting those who've lived here for decades." "Last I checked," Michael said evenly, "buying a house doesn't require neighborhood approval for what I do with my own property." "Well, we'll see about that," Diane said, her voice taking on a threatening edge. "The Oakwood Lane Community Standards Committee takes these matters very seriously." "There is no committee, Diane," Michael sighed. "I checked with the city before I bought the place. This street doesn't have an HOA or any binding community standards." Diane's face flushed. "Just because it's non-official doesn't mean we don't have standards." She jabbed a finger toward the half-dismantled pool. "That pool is a landmark. The Hendersons' grandchildren learned to swim there. It's part of our street's heritage." James stifled a laugh, quickly disguising it as a cough when Michael shot him a warning glance. "I appreciate your concern," Michael said diplomatically, "but the pool stays down. It's a liability. And frankly, it's my decision to make." Diane's nostrils flared. She pulled out her phone, tapping the screen with sharp, angry movements. "We'll just see what the city has to say about this disruption. There are ordinances about noise and property alterations, you know." As she stormed back toward her house, Tony shook his head. "Man, you've got yourself a real piece of work there." Michael watched Diane's retreating figure, a sense of unease settling over him. He'd dealt with difficult people before. It came with the territory as a first responder, but there was something about Diane that suggested this wouldn't be a simple disagreement between neighbors. "Let's just get this done," he said, turning back to the pool. "I doubt she can cause any real trouble." He couldn't have been more wrong. Michael leaned back in his kitchen chair, staring at the property documents spread across the table. It was nearly 2 a.m., but sleep wasn't coming tonight, not with this discovery. He pulled up the county's property records website on his laptop, confirming what the paper documents suggested. When the Patterson and Rivera properties had been built in the early 1990s, a 6-foot easement had existed between them. Sometime in 2016, about a year after the Hendersons' foreclosure and several owners before Michael, Diane had extended her garden and installed the Victorian fence. According to the permit she'd filed, the fence was supposedly built exactly on the property line. But it wasn't, not even close. The next morning, bleary-eyed but resolute, Michael called in a personal day at the station. This was too important to put off. His captain, understanding after hearing an abbreviated version of the situation, approved it immediately with a sympathetic, "Neighbor disputes are worse than house fires sometimes. At least fires eventually go out." Michael's first call was to a real estate attorney, who confirmed his suspicions during a brief consultation. "Classic encroachment case," the attorney said. "The garden and fence are clearly on your property. You have several options, from demanding immediate removal to granting an easement, for an appropriate fee, of course." His second call was to the most reputable surveyor in the county, who unfortunately couldn't come out for 3 weeks. "We're booked solid," the receptionist apologized. "Unless this is an emergency?" Michael thought of Diane's smug face as she photographed his house. "It's an emergency," he confirmed, agreeing to the rush fee without hesitation. While waiting for these professional wheels to turn, Michael decided to gather intelligence. A quick text to Sarah resulted in an invitation to coffee that afternoon at her kitchen table, where she'd lived for 15 years, long enough to know the neighborhood history. The Pattersons, Fred and Diane, moved in about 20 years ago, Sarah explained, pouring Michael a second cup. They were the perfect suburban couple at first. Fred was on the city council, Diane was a school administrator. They hosted backyard parties, knew everyone by name. "What changed?" Michael asked. Sarah's expression darkened. "Fred had an affair with his dental hygienist. Cliché, I know. The divorce was ugly. Public. Diane got the house and half his pension, but she lost her social standing. Fred had been the gregarious one, the connector. Without him?" She shrugged. She turned inward, then bitter, then controlling. "And the garden? When did that happen?" After the divorce, it became her obsession. The roses especially. They'd always had a small garden, but after Fred left, she expanded it significantly. Won some local competitions, got featured in that regional gardening magazine. Sarah sipped her coffee thoughtfully. It gave her back some of the status she'd lost in the divorce. Now it's her identity, the award-winning rose garden that enhances neighborhood property values. Michael nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place. Those competition wins. They're why she's so fixated on community standards, isn't they? It's not just about control. It's about maintaining her reputation. Bingo, Sarah confirmed, and why she hated the pool coming down. The Hendersons were her allies in maintaining what she calls neighborhood character. They supported her garden expansions, and she looked the other way when their pool fell into disrepair. On his walk home, Michael passed Diane's garden with new eyes. The meticulous rose bushes, the coordinated color schemes, the elaborate trellises, all of it screaming for validation, and all of it technically on his property. That evening, another letter appeared in Michael's mailbox, this one on official city stationery. The building department was investigating reports of unpermitted structural modifications at his address. The letter was signed by Jason Patterson, Assistant Code Enforcement Officer, Diane's brother-in-law. Michael tacked the letter to his refrigerator with a magnet, right next to his appointment card with the surveyor. 3 more weeks of harassment seemed like a small price to pay for what was coming. That night, he dreamed of orange survey stakes and roses uprooted from contested soil.